Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Alrighty, Husserl. So we're in part 3 now. Procedure of Pure Phenomenology in Respect of Methods and Problems. Chapter 1, Preliminary Considerations of Method. You can tell from the heading of this chapter, it's not a particularly exciting chapter, but we'll still go through it because Husserl wrote it and I read it. So we'll talk about it a little bit. The first section is the clearness of intuitions. So Husserl says here that our experiences are usually vague and unclear, and he describes them as appearing at a kind of distance from us. And when this is the case, the essences that we uncover from those experiences will also be vague and unclear. And he talks about there being different grades of clearness for both individual objects and for essences. And the goal, obviously, is to bring these to complete clearness. And he talks about an absolute clearness, an absolute nearness at one point in this graded series. And this is what he calls pure self-givenness. And so obviously that's going to be connected with intuition, because in intuition, something is given to us directly. It's not mediated through concepts or theories or ideas. It's just immediately, directly grasped. So anyway, he talks about the process of making clear being made up of two interconnected sets of processes. And the first is rendering something intuitable. So that was what I was talking about before. It has to be graspable by intuition. That is to say, not like, as I always feel I have to say every time I use the word intuition, not through some mystical kind of sixth sense way of knowing or feeling something's true, but from a direct apprehension of the object in consciousness, whether it be from your senses, so whether it be a perception of something external, or whether it be something in memory, or whether it be something in your imagination. As long as any one of those can provide intuitions, which we can use to uncover essences, to get to do our phenomenology. So the thing has to be rendered intuitable first, and the second set of processes is to enhance the clearness of what is already intuitable. So we have to render something intuitable in the first case. So what we're looking for is intuitable objects. The only kinds of knowledge that Husserl is interested in here is intuitive knowledge, immediately graspable. And then once something is graspable intuitively, we have to enhance the clarity of that. So we have to make sure that we are really understanding exactly what it is that is being presented to us. And Husserl talks about what is given attaining clarity through a process of unfolding. And he describes this by the thing first maybe becoming clear from a certain perspective, then it becomes obscure. The more we look into it, then it becomes clear again. But the main idea seems to be here that perfect clearness is a process. We start with that intuition, and then we investigate it from different angles. We put it in different situations, or imagine it in different situations. We just kind of drill down into it with this kind of clarity of purpose that phenomenology is all about. And he says also, it will be going too far to say that all self-evident apprehension of the essence demands that the subsumed particulars in their concrete fullness should be fully clear. So when it comes to grasping essences, it's enough to grasp generalities. It's enough to understand kind of the big picture, as it were, the general insights that make the thing what it is. When even though the exemplifying instances themselves, the individual objects, have a lower grade of clearness. So the essences are what we're interested in here, and it's possible to grasp the essences with clarity, even if the individuals that we're grasping the essences from are perceived with a lower grade of clearness. Then he goes on to talk about perception and free fancy. So perception, which we've already looked at quite a lot, we've talked about it a lot, especially external perception, which is the primordial Detour experience, that is object-giving, the primordial object-giving experience, gives the object in perfect clearness, even for acts. So perception, especially external perception, gives us something graspable in perfect clearness. And because of this, perception has advantages over other forms of representation. However, Husserl asks us to consider anger. So if we think about anger reflected on, to understand it, is actually dissipating anger. That is, the content is modifying as we study it, as we look at it. Because if you're angry, you're not reflecting on anger, right? You're just angry. But if you start reflecting on anger, you adopt a different, your anger necessarily dissipates a little bit. It must. If your attention is now turned towards the anger itself. You're no longer focused on what it is that's making you angry. So what you're actually studying when you're trying to investigate anger itself is anger dissipating, is anger that is slowly ebbing away. And that's not what you wanted to study. Thus, in phenomenology, as in all eidetic sciences, representations, or to speak more accurately, free fancies, assume a privileged position over against perceptions, and that even in the phenomenology of perception itself, excepting, of course, that of the sensory data. So even though we can get most of our primordial data from A, the main types of perception and representation, and B, examples of judgments, supposals, feelings, volitions, etc. These can't give us everything. So we'll never have these direct experiences of all kinds of conscious objects. And even the geometer, Husserl says, uses imagination more than perceptions of figures and models to do their work. So we can get a lot of our data from those perception and representation and examples, specific examples, concrete examples. But imagination is the other way in which we can grasp everything. Everything becomes open to us through imagination. And imagination is phenomenologically legitimate because we're looking to understand experience itself. We're not looking to understand something different from us. We're looking to understand the structures of conscious experience. And so we can do that through imagination just as well as we can with direct perception, say. So even the geometer, so when it comes to mathematics, to geometry, they use imagination more, Husserl says, than actual direct perceptions. And even more so then for the phenomenologist, who can then turn to things like historical examples, or even better, to art and poetry, because these offer us richly detailed portrayals of objects that we can use to uncover essences. And that's the idea, right? We're looking to uncover these the essences of these objects as they appear for us in consciousness. The element which makes up the life of phenomenology, as of all eidetical science, is fiction. Fiction is the source whence the knowledge of eternal truths draws its sustenance. So kind of a nice quote there. I wanted to throw that one in. Fiction is the source of all, where the knowledge of eternal truths draws its sustenance. I was trying to paraphrase it, but I couldn't. Just ended up repeating it. So yeah, but I like that. That's kind of cool, right? So fiction, it has some legitimate philosophical weight in phenomenology. And that's, like I said, because we're not studying something external to us, some realm of extended matter or something which is different from us. We're studying consciousness itself. So free fancy or imagination is just as useful. And no surprise then that all the phenomenologists were interested in art in some form or other. They tended to focus on one or the other, or on one particular kind of art, but they were all heavily interested in art, and they wrote about it a lot. They often did it themselves. Sartre wrote plays and novels, and Heidegger with poetry. Merleau-Ponty was all about art. So these guys, they all used art and poetry and creative endeavors to further their philosophy. And even today, philosophers do it today. They talk a lot about Dostoevsky or Tolstoy. They're always bringing up references from those books. That's actually why I read the Brothers Karamazov, because I kept hearing references to it from people making references to what's his name, Ivan Karamazov, or the Grand Inquisitor or whatever. So yeah, so it's still a legitimate kind of way to do philosophy, and especially phenomenology. And this brings us to the second part. So that was the first part, developing clearness of our intuitions. The second part of the video is two kinds of eidetic science. Now, when we think of eidetic disciplines, we usually think of mathematics, especially geometry and arithmetic. But Husserl asks here, is phenomenology as a descriptive, i.e. non-mathematical eidetic discipline, is that not perverse? He uses that word. Is this not some kind of perverse distortion of science? So he asks us to consider the traditional sciences, which we can break into two: eidetic sciences and empirical sciences. In the eidetic sciences, as we saw in the last video, we can exclude the formal mathematical eidetic disciplines, which leaves us with the mathematical eidetic sciences. For example, geometry. Geometry seems to be Husserl's go-to example here. And he says that every theoretical science in this realm has a domain of knowledge determined by a higher genus. And if this highest genus forms a complete region, forms a kind of a totality in itself, a complete branch of study, if you like, a complete study, a complete branch that we can study, a complete region that we can study, and that is kind of self-sustainable, or is self-contained, I think is better, then the science governing it is concrete. And if not, the science is abstract. And so by way of example here, he talks about the eidetic science of nature. So we're dealing with concrete objects, we're dealing with things, versus abstract objects that arise in that region. Things like space, time, motion. None of those objects stand alone. None of them are self-contained. There is no space without an object occupying it. Well, there is no time without objects without objects in time. Same with motion. There's no such thing as motion on its own. Motion is always applied to an object. So the eidetic science of nature gives us the region, and that's the genus. The genus itself is self-contained. It gives us a whole that we can study. Therefore, it's a region, and within that region we have these abstract objects which we can study. And with empirical sciences, these run parallel to the eidetic sciences. So we have one physical science of nature, which is broken up into various disciplines. Same kind of thing. That's the structure of these traditional sciences. And the point is that traditional eidetic science doesn't proceed by description. So geometry, for example, doesn't grasp in single intuitions its data. Rather, it relies on a handful of fundamental constraints, axioms, which are then used to infer deductively from. And Husserl says, a finite number of concepts and proportions determines completely and unambiguously on lines of pure logical necessity the totality of all possible formations in the domain. So that's the structure of these traditional eidetic sciences. It's not about description, it's not about intuition. We formulate these axioms which ground everything, all of our knowledge is grounded upon, because we infer deductively from those. So it's highly rigorous and logical in its approach. And Husserl calls this a manifold. He calls such a manifold mathematically exhaustively definable. And the definable there refers to the axioms. They give us the definitions. And mathematically exhaustive refers to the fact that nothing is left undetermined. Everything is determinable from those original axioms. And a system of axioms which exhaustively defines a manifold is, Husserl calls, a definite system of axioms. And the deductive discipline that follows from this is a definite discipline. And such a system is then mathematical. So what about phenomenology? Phenomenology is also concrete eidetic, material. It's part of this material eidetic realm, because it deals with experiential essences which are regional. That is to say, concrete, not abstract. So, and we saw this in the last video as well. So, should we then follow geometry and look for a set of axioms to build our deductive theories on top of? That's the question. Otherwise put, is the stream of consciousness a genuine mathematical manifold? And before we answer that, Husserl notes that for this type of model to work, we need exactness in the system. That is, in our axioms and in our theories. But exactness in the system requires exactness in the essence itself. And this prompts a detour into the difference between descriptive and exact sciences. So a descriptive science deals with sensory or intuitively grasped objects. And in this kind of science, we can perfectly describe concepts related to real things, for example in the natural sciences, using words like, and these are examples that Husserl gives, notched, indented, lens-shaped, umbiliform, and so on. But these kinds of descriptions are essentially and not accidentally inexact. So, or despite the fact that these are perfectly clear descriptions of objects, they are inexact. They're not mathematically, they don't have that mathematical precision that we get from something like geometry. And therefore, Husserl says they're unmathematical, despite the clarity that they give us. And I've got the quote here, which I'm not going to throw up, but I'll just read for you. The most perfect geometry and its most perfect practical control cannot help the descriptive student of nature to express precisely in exact geometrical concepts that which in so plain, so understanding, and so entirely suitable a way he expresses in the words notched, indented, lens-shaped, yada yada yada. So so that's the idea here. We have this perfect clarity using these inexact methods, inexact descriptions, and they are essentially inexact. There is no way to make them, to give them the kind of precise exactitude that we can expect from the mathematical sciences. As opposed to those exact mathematical sciences, which don't use sensory or intuitively grasped objects, but rely rather on ideal concepts. And that's kind of the fundamental difference here. They use these ideal concepts instead, therefore they can be exact and mathematical. They're not kind of burdened by reality, by having to conform to actual things. They translate things from the real, from the concrete, from the actual, into this more pristine, ideal form. And when you have that ideal form, not constrained by the messiness of reality itself, of the real thing, then you can have the precision, the exactitude that mathematics is so famous for. So to summarize this little detour, the constancy and clear-cut distinguishability of generic concepts or generic essences, which have their scope within the flux of things, should not be confused with the exactness of the ideal concepts and the genera whose scope includes an ideal element throughout. So there are basically the idea there are two valid methods here that we can pursue to reach clearness, to reach clarity of understanding. The first is the exact root of mathematics, geometry. The second, for example, geometry. The second is this inexact descriptive method, which still yields clarity, but because it doesn't deal with ideal concepts, because it deals with real things, then it's incapable of having that same level of exactitude. But despite that, it is just as valid knowledge and it's just as clear. So when we come back to phenomenology, just to finish up discussing that after the detour, phenomenology takes the phenomenological particular object, the eidetic singularity, just as it appears in the flow of experience. But this is ambiguous because it's a singular concrete object. But at a higher level, so there's no clarity there. It's necessarily ambiguous because it's singular, because it's an individual. And all individuals are different, right? But at a higher level, the generic essence of the domain can be obtained with rigorous conceptual precision. And so the domain, Husserl mentions a few examples, could be perception itself. It could be a subordinate species of perception, like the perception of physical things or the perception of animals. Or it could be a different kind of domain like memory or volition, whatever. But when we get to that, whatever domain we take, if we abstract out, I guess, from the singular individual concrete object to the generic essence, to try and determine the generic essence, we can achieve this essence with the same kind of rigor and with the same kind of conceptual precision. Not with the same, but we can achieve it with rigor and conceptual precision, which is adequate for descriptive science, which is appropriate for descriptive science. So it's not like a lesser form of science in comparison to the mathematical. That's the idea. So no deductive theorizing is to be done in phenomenology. And that's because we have a completely different method here. There are no axioms. We're not investigating ideal concepts. So we can't form axioms, and we can't logically, deductively infer things from those. That's not how that's not how a descriptive science works. So immediate inferences are possible, but these, as unintuitable descriptions, will always have to lead eventually to direct essential insight, direct pure intuition. That's always the touchstone here for Husserl. We have to have that intuitive grasp of something. That's what makes it. That's what makes. Remember those two things that make clarity possible. The thing has to be intuitable first, and then we have to enhance the clearness of that. So we've always got to get back to this an intuition of some sort. It's not enough just to have theoretical constructs. It's not enough to have inferences based on axioms, for example. We have to get to that essential insight. So a quote to finish: "It is only a misleading prejudice to suppose that the historical methods of the a priori sciences, which are exact ideal sciences throughout, must be accepted without question as the pattern for every new method of science, and especially for our transcendental phenomenology, as though all eidetic sciences must show one type of method only, that of exactness." And that's just exactly saying what I've been kind of possibly repeating throughout the second section. Two methods here: one for the exact ideal sciences, another one for the descriptive sciences, and neither is better than the other. One should not be reduced to the other. They are both perfectly appropriate for their domains, and they can both yield perfect clearness of objects. All right, summary. So the first section of the video was clearness of intuitions, and here we noted that Husserl admits of grades of clearness for his intuitions and his objects, and he paid a special notice to free fancy, which enjoys a privileged position in phenomenology because we're investigating not something external to us which we have to grasp in a particular way, but because we're investigating consciousness itself, the structures of consciousness. Imagination takes on a legitimacy that it doesn't have in other sciences. And there are two kinds of eidetic science. The first was exact, for example, geometry, and this relies on axioms and deductive inferences. And these kinds of sciences are mathematically exhaustively definable. And that the big, I think, defining point here for exact sciences is that they use ideal concepts. And it's this which means they can be exact and mathematical. And the other kind of eidetic science was descriptive, for example, phenomenology. And this also is capable of rigorous conceptual precision, as we saw with the descriptive language, describing shapes, notched, indented, and so on. So there is precision available, but it is essentially inexact. It just can't have the same kind of precision, that exact mathematical precision of the former science. But this is in no way meant to diminish the descriptive sciences at all. And that's exactly what Husserl says at the end. It is a prejudice to suppose only exact ideal sciences yield apodictic knowledge. All right, and that is the end of this video. A little bit shorter, I think, but yeah, cool. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.